Hello, welcome to Chapter 6, Adolescence, where we will discuss the journey of all of us from childhood to early adulthood. If you've read the book, or if you remember what we talked about in class, many of the concepts covered in this chapter are more about issues that we need to discuss rather than technical terms that we need to cover on an exam. And as such, this is probably the shortest narrated slideshow or lecture that we will have this semester. One way to characterize adolescence is to describe it as a time of storm and stress, in which adolescence is characterized by challenges, difficulties, anxiety. We'll actually test that assumption to find out if that is the normal way that most people can expect to go through adolescence. Also, we'll talk about how adolescents do some weird things. They do things differently than adults. Are there good explanations for why in terms of brain and social issues that can explain why adolescents process the world in a different way than traditional adults? Discussions of these and much more coming up. So let's start things off lightly with a little joke. As we can see, the issue is the same, wearing pants in an abnormal way, although the different generations wear them quite differently. I'm reminded of Larry David from Curb Your Enthusiasm, a characteristic old guy who's always having some difficulty or other with how his pants are working. The most obvious demarcation or line for which adolescents begin is puberty. As we all know, puberty is characterized as a physical change that is started by an increase in hormones. This is directed by the hypothalamus, a small part of the old brain in the limbic system that is located underneath the thalamus, but it is hugely active in directing the increase in hormones during puberty. Also, we can see some neuroscience updates. I promise I won't cover a ton of these. We'll keep it simple here. One big change is that the amygdala reaches its mature state. The amygdala is also in the limbic system, and as you can see, it corresponds to be active when we are experiencing fear and anger. What this means is that this explains what we observe with adolescents, which is they experience more intense fear and anger. And here is the issue. We've basically matured or brought to full adult capacity the ability to feel the full fear and anger corresponding to a mature amygdala. But as adults, we also need our higher brain to regulate these feelings of fear and anger. And so the experience of the initial fear and anger hits hard, but adolescents still don't have a fully mature frontal cortex and especially prefrontal cortex, which are often referred to as the brakes for expression of anger and fear. So what this means is it is a dangerous combo and also corresponds to what we see: strong and violent, sometimes emotional swings that are not regulated by a fully mature adult new brain or frontal cortex. And what this means is you often see suboptimal decision making, irrational decision making, right? It's all emotion driven and not rational driven. Also, sometimes we just skip that whole step of needing to take action and then thinking critically about it. We skip the critical thinking for adolescence and just react right away. And again, primarily potentially due to just fear and anger. Again, this is a dangerous combo, and this also explains why we see adolescents reacting in ways that we would describe as rash or not thinking things through, and this is corresponding to how their brain is set up to process these things. We also look at the characteristic physical change. This is the most directly observable thing that we see, the growth spurt when puberty hits. As you can see, there is an asynchrony between genders in that females will experience the growth spurt generally a year or two earlier than males, which corresponds to late elementary school, early middle school, where you see some females who are much larger than the largest males. Of course, males take a little bit longer to hit that peak, but that peak is a little bit higher. And so after the pubertal growth spurt for males kicks in, we see the lasting changes and differences of greater height and weight corresponding to the growth spurt. So the effect is bigger, the growth spurt is bigger for males, but it takes a couple years later to kick in on average. Here are some issues that we will talk about in much more detail in our participation activity. But we talk about a lot of risky behaviors that adolescents are uniquely susceptible to. Part of this is due to the brain configurations that we talked about a couple slides ago, in that we have a very mature amygdala to process intense fear and anger, but not that corresponding mature frontal cortex, prefrontal cortex to regulate that. And we see the behaviors, of course. One characteristic of puberty is the bringing online of the sexual organs, partly due to the hormones' increased production, which leads to adolescents wanting to use those reproductive organs. And so we have issues of teen pregnancy, which are risk factors for career achievement, potential earnings later on, and of course the danger of STDs, right? Kids are thinking about, potentially adolescents thinking about wanting to engage their newly functional sexual organs and not taking that second step to think about the long-term consequences, potentially negative, of engaging in those activities. We'll talk a little bit more about drug abuse as well. Clearly, alcohol, drugs are not legal for adolescents to consume, but also we have issues starting with abuse of legal drugs such as caffeine, potentially sleeping pills, also abuse of prescription drugs such as Adderall, Ritalin, that are legally obtained for people who have a diagnosis to use them, such as ADHD, but not for people who are not diagnosed. Also, we have major issues with dietary concerns. Here's where we see, according to the book, 20% of adolescents will have some sort of psychological disorder. And one of the more common psychological disorders, in addition to depression and anxiety disorders, would be the onset of eating disorders. And there are a lot of reasons why these might take place. We can look at media coverage and idealization of body types. Adolescents will have potentially a body type that they want to have, and their bodies are still changing into the form that their adult bodies will take, and oftentimes that causes negative self-esteem consequences. Also, we have the issue of poor nutrition. Adolescents will often feel sort of invincible and are thinking about basically wanting to fill the desire to feel full, and often will, if given the choice, eat a diet that is unhealthy, full of calories but empty calories, such as chips and candy. And so it is in part, again, due to the compromised decision making that adolescents will show on the parents and the educational systems to restrict somewhat the choice to consume only poor food, poor nutrition. And then, of course, we talk about some social issues as well. Stress is a very real thing. Also, we have some crossing of boundaries. So we have high school students, adolescents, potentially taking college classes. We have the increased reliance about functioning in an online world, which just invites more social comparisons. And we also have not only the issues of traditional bullying, physical and relational, but also the online aspect of those. And so you combine all those things, and there's a lot of potentially felt pressure to succeed and to achieve certain goals that adolescents might show. I like this diagram. This is not anatomically correct, but this is more corresponding to the behaviors that we see in adolescence. So of course we see, due to puberty, hormones, the turning on of the sexual systems, the birds and the bees occupies a lot of adolescent thought. You can also see the indestructibility cortex, right? They're not thinking about the long-term consequences of things. Their brain might not even turn on that rational portion in many intense decisions. Then, of course, we have this very tiny peer resistance gland and the ability to be seen in public with patience lobe. So I hope you got a kick out of this, but it also does correspond to some of the behavior that we've been talking about. It's also important to think about how the brain is changing through adolescence. Adolescence is a wide range. Clearly, we're seeing the start of age 10 or 12 when adolescence begins and can continue through age 20. Usually we think it ends a little bit before age 20, but these age ranges are relative. And here we see those blue areas of the cortex, the new brain, that are mostly done changing, the motor cortex, sensory cortex, visual areas, and also parts of the prefrontal cortex. It's still not quite done, but it's close. But here we see large areas of the frontal cortex corresponding to judgment and decision-making and morality. And we see how much these still have to develop to get to the blue or mature levels. Now, once we hit to age 20, still not completely full, but a lot of development has taken place, and still some development for memory and language areas as well. So the important part is to remember that once someone is done with adolescence, that does not mean that they have a fully mature brain. That is going to happen another 5 or 6 years later in their mid-20s, as we'll talk about for the exam 3 material. Also, it's important to look inside the brain. As your book documents, we see the continuing trend, which has started already in childhood before adolescence, of changing some of this gray matter into white or myelinated pathways. And so the process that was already started continues out. And so even in adult brain, the outer areas will still be gray matter, but a larger ratio of the cortex will be myelinated or white or more efficient matter. And we can see adolescent years corresponding to these brain changes, increased ability to learn and create, increased difficulty of recovering for damage from drugs and alcohol, increased risk of addiction, mental illness, increased desire for risk-taking. So adolescents are at risk for all of these things, and we still need to have, even though we're giving them more freedom, we still need to have some control over the situations to keep them from giving into their worst or most dangerous tendencies. One aspect of the damage that an alcohol use disorder in this case can show is this is adjusted hippocampal volume. And we see subjects with alcohol use disorders often picked up in adolescence will show just a lot lower average hippocampal volume compared to healthy subjects. And this is the hippocampus has to do with your explicit memory, details you can remember, how efficiently you can remember what happened a day or a week ago, or what you learned in class. And of course, what we already know, shown here in terms of the brain, and I believe this would be the alcohol use disorder brain. You can see just less density of the cortex, and specifically the hippocampus. You're just less able to remember things. And I think the goal for adolescents is let's give them the best chance to develop the best functioning adult brain that they can get, right? And then once they're adults, it's up to them if they want to tear it down. But let's at least let it reach its peak development before they even reach that or compromise that by taking drugs and alcohol. Let's check in with what Piaget has to say about how cognition has changed in adolescence. He characterized the typical adolescent cognitive stage as a formal operational stage. Bear in mind, we are transitioning from what we covered in late childhood to be the concrete operational stage, right? Much emphasis on what we described as convergent thinking. The world is black and white. There are right answers. There are wrong answers. There's little room for the gray area in between. There's a right and wrong way to do things. People are either good or bad. Now what we see, the major development for formal operations involves more emphasis on divergent thinking. Instead of the one right answer, what is the best answer? You are able to think of multiple aspects of a problem that might be important in coming up with a solution to it. Also, you can talk about things like pros and cons, right? So there's not black and white. This is exploring the nuance and the gray area that really is an important part of lots of problems that adults have to solve. One thing to keep in mind is this improves drastically, this ability to think in the gray area, but it is not quite equal to adults. So we'll talk about this more later, but just keep that in your back pocket. One issue about puberty is, again, the asynchrony between genders. So generally it happens earlier for girls and a little bit later for boys, and tends to extend even longer into the teens for boys. Another issue is early puberty, especially for girls. It starts earlier for girls today than 50 years ago. And one thing I just thought might be a potential conflict is that a general trend that we're seeing is kids also are staying in the house longer than they did 50 years ago, and more of that time that they're spending in the house is dealing with puberty. And so that just means more time for potential conflict between adolescents who are expecting to have more freedom and parents who are also wanting to support this exploration of newfound freedom, but also still imposing rules and still doing things that authoritative parents, that gold standard, says they would still do. Another interesting point here is, note this age range. There's some definitions where you can even see earlier onset. There's lots of definitions for the physical changes, right? So we can talk about breast budding in girls, onset of their period, or pubic hair, or boys. You can measure growth of facial hair. You can measure in both genders actual hormone levels. What's interesting is that those don't all turn on at the same time. And so depending on what measure of the start of adolescence or puberty you use, you get some different exact estimates of age ranges. So just keep that in mind. We don't know exactly when puberty starts, right? It's this combination of physical changes, and they don't all start at the exact same time. Let's talk about what's happening in the schools. Again, a lot of this we will discuss in our participation activity, but we see the start of adolescence beginning in middle school. And we could talk about curricula being a little too rigid, right? And this is the shift from concrete to formal operational thinking, where we need to acknowledge that there's less of a one right absolute answer, and instead structure things to think about the problems and the nuance and the potential issues rather than do this, do that. Also, we had the issue of self-esteem and the exploration of identity in adolescence. If we have potentially psychological disorders such as depression, but not even a disorder, somebody who's just dealing with a bout of depression or anxiety, do they have enough people in the school that they feel are adults that they can trust to confide in? A lot of studies suggest that a good portion of middle school students do not believe there are enough trusted adults, and we need to be actively concerned with addressing that need. Also, once we get to the formal operational thinking stage, we're starting to see more of a connection between what kids are learning in school and how they see that applied in the world around them. They take greater interest in the causes of people, whether it's global warming or cruelty to animals. And so it is often suggested that service learning is one way to make those connections for kids, and schools could probably emphasize service learning a little bit more. As we move to high school, we see initiation or bullying or hazing rituals. And so clearly they do, on a good way, foster some sense of belonging, but in many cases, again, if we're looking at adolescents making their own judgments, oftentimes they're not thinking critically about the long-term consequences. They are very likely to take bullying and hazing way too far, causing lasting damage. Also, we've talked about high school. What is the dropout rate? Again, there's lots of different ways to measure or operationalize or put numbers to the dropout rate, but generally the low, and of course there's great differences between rural or urban dropout rates or statewide levels. But I've seen estimates ranging from as low as 9 for the national average to upwards of 30, right? And so that's a big difference here, but somewhere in between these numbers is probably the best annual average. I think what's important to keep in mind is estimates seem to have shown that from a very problematic time 20 years ago, turn of the century 2000, seems like dropout rates have been going down. It's still a major problem, but it seems like we're seeing some improvement on that. Of course, also, we can look at racial ethnic differences in the dropout rates. And we see over time from the 70s to 2004, and we need to update this. This is the best one I have for right now, though. We see Caucasian, non-Hispanic, white has the lowest dropout rate, followed secondly to the African American community, and then Latino have a much overall higher dropout rate. And look at the variation that changes during different time periods. So I think there's just a lot more variation, and we can see here that the Latino high school community is just at a generally higher risk for dropping out of high school. Lightening things up a little bit, this going back to the peer resistance part of the brain, not really having a strong influence. We see here style, trying to fit in, trying to try on different identities as something that adolescents do, and in many ways express themselves in a form that the parents or adults in their corresponding family unit or society in general find weird. So now the question is it abnormal? Is it disturbing? Is there something wrong with teens searching out their identity in strange ways? And again, strange as defined by adults. Well, let's see what Erikson has to say about this question. Erikson, first of all, described adolescence as the search for identity. And I think that fits very closely with what we see in the adolescence that we know today. One thing to find out is, what does that search for identity look like? In many cases, you can think about it in terms of classic 80s or 90s movies. What clique in high school do adolescents want to identify with? Whether they want to identify as being nerds or goths or punks or jocks, right? But it also can look at ethnic identity. I think again to the example of tennis player Naomi Osaka, who's part Japanese, part Caribbean, and grew up most of her life in the United States, right? But she plays for the flag of Japan and is a big, big cultural phenomenon in Japan, but doesn't really speak much Japanese. And so it's been interesting to see her exploration of ethnic identity play out in front of the worldwide audience. One thing that Erikson put forth that we don't necessarily agree with is the notion that crisis is an essential part of adolescence. Lots of cross-cultural research has shown countries, or especially racial ethnic groups within countries, where tons of stress for adolescents is not normal. And that leads us as to Americans to have the attitude that no, we don't just shrug our shoulders and say it's going to happen, but instead there's probably something we can do about the stress that our adolescents feel, so that it's not normal and expected for most of them, right? So first of all, Erikson would say you have to have some sort of crisis, meaning you're feeling that you're not accepted by some peer group, and so you try on a new identity, right? And then once you're trying on a new identity, how committed are you to the bit, right? Is it something that is going to last long term into adulthood, or is it just something that's a phase? You've tried it for a couple months or a year, and then it's not fitting, and then you go back into crisis and want to try something else. So I think the general pattern here of trying on new identities and then deciding whether you're committed to them is true, but I think our contemporary or current view is that we don't have to describe trying on a new identity as a crisis necessarily. It's just normal, right? And I think parents should realize that according to Erickson, trying on new and different identities during adolescence is healthy. And I think the idea is, think about maybe somebody you knew who in high school, they knew what they wanted to be the entire time. They wanted to be a medical doctor. And then once they get into med school, they realize that, oh, maybe this isn't what I want to do. With the idea that if they would have tried on the identity early on, they could maybe not have wasted that time into adulthood, still searching out their identity. And of course, we have the conflict that we've mentioned before with parents, with leaders in the educational field. To search out identity, you have to have the freedom to try new things, right? And so parents and teachers have to let go. They have to let some control off to the side, but also maintain strong parental and teacher educational relationships, right? So let things go. Leave adolescents with a chance to explore identity, but also provide some structure, right? So if we think about other cultures, I'm thinking about the Amish community, Rumspringa, where you leave your community and try out the non-Amish community, and if you come back, that's a sign that you're committed to it, right? Or if we talk about walkabout for Australian Aboriginal cultures, where you leave your family and walk about, experience different aspects of the country. I think those are abnormal. That's a lot of freedom to give to an adolescent to just go out by themselves. And so what we typically see is some combination of mini walkabout, where you can express your individuality, but there's still some structure from parents. As we start to wrap things up, some adolescent trends that we see are clearly the embrace of technology, and technology has the great advantage of connecting us, although the problem is the cyber world is hard to regulate, and we see lots more texting, sexting, cyber dating, and of course, if adolescents are not feeling accepted by the peer groups that they deal with in person, they're going to try and find acceptance online. And of course, you can find lots of issues dealing with catfishes, mistaken identity, false identities, people trying to lure people for sex and abuse. And there's just, again, if adolescents don't have that next step to step back, put the brakes on their initial impulse, this could lead to a lot of dangerous combinations. Also, we see the issue of depression and more specifically the consequence of suicide. One example that's gotten a lot of attention is the Nunavut area in Canada, which is near the Arctic Circle. And you see a lot of this, what we discussed the last slide, trying to connect with the larger culture of Canada, but also being separated from it, and also having what are sometimes the negative attributions of being a native, right? So for example, Native Americans, there's often a stigma potentially with being Native American, just like being Aboriginal in Australia can carry a stigma with it, right? And so you want to embrace your cultural heritage, but also feel like your cultural heritage is not valued in your country. And so what they were seeing in Nunavut was extremely high suicide rates for their adolescent groups. What they found was a good solution was providing ways for them to explore their identity, oftentimes their native or regional heritage. So, for example, cultural events in the area allowed them to explore their identity, try on an embrace of their native heritage, and also how does that merge with the greater Canadian culture. And what they found was that it was pretty successful, right? It led to connections, it led to this natural identity exploration, and helped to reduce the suicide rates. Also, we look at cultural considerations. Many adolescents now may feel a need to take care of their parents, right? We're just seeing a lot more less traditional and crossing of lines. So instead of you're graduated from high school, you're out, instead we have the need to take care of parents who are sick or who are experiencing job loss. We don't think about it here in the US, but in many cultures, adolescents are expected to be starting to prepare for a marriage, and they may not get to choose their marriage partner. And so what rights do adolescents have, and how much influence do parents or other adults have on choosing who gets to, for example, marry you? Also, we talk about rites of passage, right? In our area, rural Ohio, driving is often viewed as a rite of passage, right? I've hit my age of 16, get me behind the wheel. But we find that increasingly that is not always a normal aspect of adolescence. So many urban areas, they may not even need to get a driver's license, or at least not with the purpose of driving, right? And so it's important, as we discuss, and this can bleed into our participation activity for adolescents, what are the essential components that adolescents across the world or across our country are expected to go through, and what are ones that maybe we think are rites of passage that are normal, that maybe instead are just stereotypes that are perpetuated by the media and other aspects of our daily experience. As we wrap things up, again, communication skills, their language is clearly developing. They have the ability, but possibly due to wanting to explore alternative identities, less interest in communicating with adults. And also this goes with the exploration of identity that we've talked about as being an essential feature of adolescence, right? So here we have the curfew police. They want to explore adolescence, try on a different identity, sneak out, maybe do something they're not supposed to do. But as we talked about, parents can't just let them have full reign to explore their identity unchecked. And so going back to authoritative parenting, yes, if you break curfew, you might get in trouble. But maybe there's a good reason. And again, authoritative parents will have that discussion with their kids. And as long as they're not getting in too much trouble or making too bad of decisions, maybe there's a middle ground that can be found for this kind of situation. All right, thank you for hanging in there and sticking with me through this discussion of adolescence. I'm looking forward to discussing many of these issues and more in our participation activity.